debates actually about the unconscious.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. You want some insight?
Yes, yes, which is why because I posed the question, in phenomenology and Zen Buddhism, the unconscious does not exist. And Freud, of course, was a scientist, and his theory of the psyche is biologically based. So the Freudian unconscious is based on instincts and drives.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what I would like to do today is to ask you to describe what the biological unconscious is for you, and how it functions.
Yeah.
So I give you the field.
Okay. So obviously there's a lot of terminology that I'll probably use, and I'll need to kind of slow down in order to try to provide a framework for people to try to understand the terms that I use. I'm not sure whether people will agree with the approach that I'll take, but let's just kind of see how things unfold.
Sure.
So in the, I guess, the realm of the neurological mind, the, I guess, predominant thinking is that we have a functional neuron which releases neurotransmitters, and they bridge the gap between one neuron and the next, and that leads to the depolarization and the firing of a neuron. Okay, so that's fundamentally, a signal going from one neuron to another. And obviously there's very many neurons in the human mind, and I guess the predominant early thinking was that each neuron had a specific task, and it was a matter of really just kind of identifying which neuron was firing for which particular task was happening within biology, right? So that kind of thinking probably originated from the one gene, one protein hypothesis that originated many, many years ago, right? And when the human genome was performed and they identified around 30,000 genes, and then looked at, well, there's over 100,000 proteins. How do 30,000 genes produce 100,000 proteins? All of a sudden, it was like, it wasn't a one-to-one stoichiometry, right? So in biology, another example of this not one-to-one stoichiometry, but a cascade of events, is blood clotting, right? So you get a wound and there's a sequence and series of events which causes the clotting of blood. And that's usually mediated through an enzymatic approach, right? So if you think about how a single event can result in a phenomenally different functional outcome, right? And when you step back a little bit and look at, well, what is it about, what is happening that escalates, cascades, to go from one thing to many things, and then to go to, many, many things. And, in the mind and in the unconscious part of the mind, there is also a cascade of event happening. And you could say, well, one neuron firing and all the branches that are connected to all the other neurons leads to all of those ones firing, and then there's feedback loops going forward and back, and some are stimulatory and some are inhibitory. So, we can spend our many, many years of our lives studying the functionality of neurons firing and the frequencies of energies that they're producing through the various scanning technologies that science has developed to look at those neurological processes. My approach, my approach has been, well, I've got a strong background in biochemistry. I can't explain particular things using biochemistry because that thinking has actually got us into the problem that we currently face. So I'm going to have to use alternative tools and look at the underpinning physics that's actually operating within the mind. And so I kind of explored the unconscious from the perspective of, well, if the conscious part of the mind is neurological or the neuron based, then the unconscious cannot be the same thing. It can't be neurologically based. And because we see light within the mind, and the connection between the light or the electromagnetic field within the structure of the atom and electromagnetism as this external light that we see, I brought those two together. So I have done a lot of work in this kind of extracellular matrix, scaffold, wound care, regenerative medicine space. So I was interested more in what's happening outside of the neuron. When the neurotransmitter is released from the end of the neuron, what is happening in that fluid space outside of the neuron? You know, is there something important in relation to the neurotransmitter and how it's actually functioning? So if we step back a little bit and go, okay, for an amino acid to become a neurotransmitter, in the case of dopamine, it needs to have a couple of things done to it, right? So one of the things that needs to have happened to become the neurotransmitter is for the carboxylic acid group to be removed from the amino acid. So this decarboxylation step occurs. So what happens is that when that CO2 is removed, the amine part of the neurotransmitter has a different function. And that function is to really receive hydrogen. And hydrogen can bind onto the amine. So it can be in two states, a state where it's NH2 and a state that it's NH3+. And the pH dependency of that ionization process, or the addition of hydrogen or a proton onto the amine, it happens that the pH of the mind allows both an on and an off state, right? So there's a percentage of the dopamine that are going to have an H and that NH2, and there's going to be a percentage of dopamine amines that are going to be in an NH3+. And so I went, I guess, down into the electromagnetic spectral lines of hydrogen as a way of investigating, are there functional properties of light at specific wavelengths within hydrogen that correspond to functional quantum tunneling processes that are happening within the neurotransmitter? Now, I have seen scientific evidence that uses infrared light to support brain health, potential applications in Alzheimer's, improvement in cognitive function and memory. And
very interesting.
Yeah, there's, you go look for the scientific literature and you go, well, infrared, there is a infrared Paschen line, the N=3 layer of the s orbital in hydrogen, and we're looking at around 820 nanometers. So that's in the infrared part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And that distance has a, has a known energy level. It's obviously outside of the human visible part of the human spectrum that we can see, which is kind of corresponding to around 400 to 750 nanometers. So that's visible light. And here we go, well, okay, so here's a function of hydrogen based on infrared wavelength of light that could potentially be used in quantum tunneling. And if you think about the amine NH3 plus as delivering hydrogen into the ring system, so let's just step back a little bit as well. So dopamine has an aromatic ring, a hexagon ring. There is only space for one atom in that hexagon ring. Coordination chemistry shows that ring systems operate to intercalate or to coordinate with minerals. And so that, it's a natural part of our biological system, is that these ring systems and neurotransmitters and the other neurotransmitter functions have both amine and hydroxyl groups, and they can be electron donating and electron withdrawing, right? So just from the underpinning science of complexation chemistry, coordination chemistry, we can understand how there are features within the atomic structure of the neurotransmitters that are interacting with single atoms. Okay, so single atoms behave differently. Single atoms have a very different property from what science has taught us in the kind of atomistic worldview of reductionism. So I've had to kind of go, I'm going to look at wavelengths of light within the structure of atoms in a sense to really identify how the light that we see in the mind is corresponding to those electron transitions that are happening within that single atom that's housed in the ring that's within the neurotransmitter. So I really kind of dug deeper into the atomic system in order to look at the one atom that's operating in there, and then look at it as the tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock of the isotope physics time reversal symmetry system and the relationship to light. So there's this beautifully evolved single atom system that sits outside of the neuron, and the isotope physics atomic time and its decay based on the half-life of the atom releasing photons of light. So I've kind of built a constructive, westernized model for what's actually happening in the neurotransmitter outside of the neuron, where it's pH dependency of creating the protonation on the amine to deliver that into the ring system to give an isotope physics decay system to give atomic timings into light being released. And so if we look at the eye mechanism of cis-trans isomerization of retinal in the rods and cones, there's a switch, right? It's like a light switch. The orientation of a bond changes when it absorbs a photon of light. If we take that and we apply that to the actual neuron and the plasma membrane of the neuron and the polyunsaturated fatty acids that are present within the structure of that neuron, it can also have cis-trans isomerization when it absorbs a photon of light, and the light that's coming from the neurotransmitter functioning outside of the neuron. So this is not a model that is based on some kind of cognitive framework. It's a model that's mechanistic, based on isotope physics that's faster than the conscious mind, so provides the light that gives the mind, the neurological part of the mind, the photons that it's observing. So it gives a separation of unconscious to conscious. It gives a separation from, the internal and the external, from the physical to the atomic light. And it really looks at the boundary between, this external that we perceive as a physical reality and the internal atomic systems of light that are operating to give the photons to the neurological system to understand what's happening. And, there are some really, I guess, quite fundamental biological ways of looking at that. You can see, if atomic decay and the release of light from these atoms is giving the photons that we see as dreams at night with our eyes closed, the human retina being inverted, looking inward, not outward, and the evolutionary processes that, physics happens first. Isotope physics is the fastest thing that's happening. So therefore, the layers of chemistry are on top of the physics, and then the layers of biology are on top of the chemistry, and then the layers of our fundamental cognitive understanding of ourselves reside as the outer skin of the onion, so to speak. So in order to understand the evolutionary changes that occurred over those 13.8 billion years, you really have to go back to the start and understand the functionality of isotope physics to lead to the production of atoms, and then lead to the production of chemicals, and then lead to the production of chemistry, right? So there's this fundamental evolutionary process that is dependent on what comes before it. So evolution, in a sense, is not DNA based. It is atomic physics based.
Right.
And it's when we look at the atomic physics happening in the unconscious part of the mind that we can see, if you put hydrogen into the atom, you're making an isotope. When that isotope comes back to a stable state, it decays and releases light. Putting hydrogen back in, you're growing the atom again. So you're growing atoms up the periodic table, and as they get higher and higher and higher up the periodic table, the positron electron pairs are getting closer and closer and closer together. So as they're closer together, they have higher energy states. So this, in a sense, gives a mechanistic perspective as to, if you keep repeating the same thing and doing it again and again and again, you get better at it. And you get better at it because the atomic physics timing happening because of the energy with the proximity getting closer and closer and closer of the positron electron pairs releases the energy faster. So you get better at things the more you repeat them, and there's a mechanistic perspective in the atomic physics that's happening to deliver that. If we think about deja vu, sensing and seeing something come into the atom and then coming back out of the atom in that time reversal symmetry. You think fight, flight, freeze, the evolutionary benefit of being able to respond faster than the conscious mind to avoid being eaten, right? So the atomic physics of isotopes unveils time at many layers and many levels because of the decay times. And all of a sudden, time, in essence, is related to the physics of decay of atoms within the mind that give you the photons at different speeds that you're perceiving as the external physical. I'm not saying that there isn't an external physical, but I'm saying there's a mechanistic window through atomic physics in which the unconscious provides the light for the conscious mind to see. And the detailed mechanistic understanding of that is being unveiled by the supersymmetry inversion model that I've been developing. So the human retina, look in, we know that we have inverted retina. The inversion system, well, that part of the brain controlling this part of the body, that part of the brain controlling this part of the body, there's essentially the crossover within us is a isotope physics mediated time reversal symmetry process. So it's mediated through atomic physics of isotopes. And that imprinted dualistic perspective within our body of chirality of left and right, positron, electron.
Yes.
That is coming through this isotope physics inverted symmetry system that's operating. So that's sitting outside of the neuron. Now, there's this really beautiful process that if you grow your atoms up to the atom iron, excuse me, iron can be photoreduced to produce Fe2+. Fe2 reacts with hydrogen peroxide, and that produces this hydroxy radical, which breaks open the ring. Hydroxylation on the aromatic ring, breaking it open, releasing the memory. But there's more to it than that. The hydroxylation of the aromatic ring leads to the production of dihydroxyacetone, methylglyoxal, lactate. These are fundamental biochemical precursors that are involved in growing the neuron. So all of a sudden, the physics of the single atom system is actually involved in creating the neuron and going from, well, we have a short-term memory, water-based system, water delivery of the proton to the hydrogen on the amine, the delivery of that into the single atom system in the aromatic ring, and it is isotope physics growing the atom and then breaking open the ring, creating the precursors, the biochemical precursors that are responsible for growing the neuron. So there's a very beautifully, I guess, integrated model that shows we have this system of hydrogen biology, key and critical for the production of memory in atomic light, but also in the creation of neurological systems post a particular level. So, you know, all of a sudden it becomes muscle memory and you don't have to think about it anymore. And it's intuitively within the biology of our neurotransmitter system connected to neurons. So that this model is really just a way of slicing time so that you can see functional steps that are happening within biology without the I don't have to measure this, right? We already have all the pieces of the puzzle. We just need to step back and look at a chronological process that's occurring naturally within biology by looking at all these different pieces of the puzzle and going, well, that makes sense that this is a precursor to grow. Here's something else that's happening that could be leading to the pruning of the neuron as well. So there's this continual neurological system that's living in the past, right? So our perception of reality is dependent on the light generated within the unconscious. And so there's a time delay, isotope physics mediated process there that's giving us the conscious reality that resides in the past. So if we're living in the past, then it's only through understanding the unconscious that really provides you, if you can see the light coming in, and if that light is from an event that's going to be threatening to your life, the energy of that typically will take the physics into a different set of biochemical processes that are happening even before your conscious mind has time to respond, and you can get out of the way of a prey-predator situation, right? So that's the fight, flight, freeze response, is essentially atomic physics-based without consciousness experiencing that. And we really must kind of go, well, people talk about leaving their bodies, right? An out-of-body experience in a car accident or a near-death experience. The fundamental coherence of light within the body in our physical manifestation of ourselves through these processes of turning light into atomic structure, turning atomic structure into biological structure through chemistry, right? So this evolutionary process that's happening within us isn't DNA based. There's something else underpinning our light body, right? And the system that operates faster than we can consciously perceive. And it's only through a logic-based framework that we get to view that. And so for me, the unconscious part of the mind is really operating in the opposite, right? If you think about a perspective of, well, I see this and it's coming, but actually it's already been, and it's actually heading in the opposite direction as well. So in a sense, when you go, I have to trick myself in order to understand how to see the unconscious part of my mind. And there's a definite challenge, you know, there's enough scientific evidence of people's experiences to say, well, the perception of reality isn't real, that's the illusion. And people know, you know, we've talked about that over the centuries in different Eastern philosophies of Maya, right? And now science is showing, well, the perception of reality is created by the mind through the physics of isotopes. And there are processes where light can be released from isotopes that is faster than the speed of light. And so there's these expandery kind of transcendent experiences that certain people have had. And when you have one of those, light is released from the atomic decay that's faster than the speed of light. And all of a sudden you're receiving information before you would receive it normally in our experience of our delayed reality. So when you start kind of looking at alpha particle emission at maybe 2.5 or 9 times faster than the speed of light through that expansion of the universe, then the human mind can also generate alpha particles and give the person that transcendent experience of negative time dilation, right? And Western society has classified that as mental illness because it hasn't understood the underpinning isotope physics that's responsible for the unconscious mind operating system outside of the neuron, because it has placed its bets, so to speak, into the atomistic reductionist perspective that the neuron is where it's at in terms of our perceived reality. But what these new scientific models are showing is that, well, actually it's outside of the neuron where the unconscious part of the mind resides. And it's essentially, if you think about that single atom, the binding of water in that environment and the structural changes of water to that environment, the biology that can turn those molecules back into CO2 and water through the hydroxy radical system, which is driven by iron, and that hydroxylation step can release water in tears, right? So there is an origin of where tears are coming from through the physics of atomic decay, ion generation, and the hydroxylation process that's involved in making biological molecules back into CO2 and water. So the release of the pain, the release of the trauma, the release of that memory from within that atom within the electromagnetic field to give the release and to cry, right? So as a human, we experience pain, emotional pain. The geometry within the water structure conveys the flow of energy through an emotional part of our body, right? The water structure within our body changes. And as that changes, it's connected to how we feel. So
that's fascinating.
We've got a connection to the water within our bodies, to the single atom system, and the cascades of events that are occurring to lead to an emotional experience. So it's like unveiling a deeper awareness of what's happening mechanistically in the physics of the unconscious part of the mind and how that relates to the experience of being human, right? So for me, I have a very mechanistic, scientific, detailed explanation for things, and I feel it as I speak it. And it's part, I guess, intuitive. It's part because of my scientific background, I've been able to look and reconcile between physics and biology by developing models that explain things. So I do think that unconscious is a part of the human being. You really need to understand the mirrored symmetry of atomic physics down at the Planck scale that takes one back to the beginning of time to understand that the entire universe is connected, right, to within.
Right.
And when you kind of experience transcendent moments, when your awareness expands to see the physics operating in that negative time dilation, you get to kind of witness the physics of the atomic decay process and the information that's coming out of that. And because we haven't had a suitable scientific model, it's kind of been placed into the too hard basket by psychiatrists, by psychologists. And it's like, well, these people, we don't understand what's going on. Let's medicate them and try to get them back down to earth, so to speak, because the experience is seeing things, hearing things, viewing things that they can't see, because what's happening is that the person is experiencing the atomic decay and release of light that's faster than the speed of light, and they get to witness things that's not happening externally. It's happening within the atomics of the unconscious part of their mind.
Right.
And it's a lack of acceptance by Western culture of the actual spiritual dimensions of atomic physics that are being revealed to the observer within the
that's fascinating. That's really an important point, and I think that Western psychiatry is reductionist and scientifically somewhat rigid.
Oh, it's incredibly rigid because of the reductionist atomistic model of materialism, right? So you have to kind of go, well, that model shows us 5% of the universe. It's missing 95%. So there are now new models available that show us what dark energy and dark matter are. They can identify that by understanding what the singularity was at the start of the universe. And I think, when those models become mainstream and scientifically valid, then there will be a shift in psychiatry, shift in psychology, a shift in acceptance of the experience that the person's going through. And, with time, a different way of handling those people in society who are having that transformational experience. And it's not a bad thing. It's just a difficult thing, right? A difficult thing to process.
Well, and as you said, I mean, in Eastern traditions, as in the Maya tradition, this sort of experience has been accepted for thousands of years.
It has. Yeah.
And with my own experience in Western psychiatry, I would have to say that, I mean, right now, let's talk a little about the crisis in psychiatry.
Yeah.
First of all, antidepressants, which act on dopamine,
Yeah.
and neurotransmitters, have been shown to cause suicidal ideation.
Yep. Yeah.
That's one thing. We don't know how antipsychotics work.
No, there's no mode of action in the scientific literature. Yeah.
Yeah. The DSM, which has reached probably number 20 now, is somewhat scattered in its diagnostic arrangements. A lot of the diagnoses overlap between, for example, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia.
Yep.
And this is why they keep putting out a new DSM to try to, you see, psychiatry is trying to make itself more and more scientific.
Except they don't have a model that accounts for the unconscious. And, you know, that is
Yes.
a really difficult place to be, right? They're trying to make themselves look scientific when they are foundationless in terms of mechanistic science.
Yes.
And, you know, you talk about SSRIs or serotonin reuptake inhibitors improving mood, and yet this ideation on suicide. There's problems because if we think about, okay, we're stopping the reuptake of a neurotransmitter back into the neuron after it's crossed from one neuron to another, it does a signal, right? So all of a sudden, in that scientific model, if you're stopping it from being reuptaken, what is it signaling again and again and again? But it's receptor mediated endocytosis, so it binds to the receptor and it goes into the cell. That's removing serotonin from the extracellular matrix space around the neuron.
Yes.
So if you think about the model that I've described of neurotransmitter function in this quantum tunneling system outside of the neuron.
Right.
So if you accumulate increased concentrations of serotonin in the extracellular milieu outside of the neuron, and that improves mood, the functionality of the neurotransmitter external to the neuron is where it's functioning, not when it's taken up back into the neuron.
Yes, yes, yes.
So
my experience with psychiatry has been that, I mean, I've studied psychiatry. I did my PhD in philosophy.
Yep.
And I've studied Carl Jasper's book on general psychopathology, which is recognized to have been the best book on psychiatry written in the 20th century. And one of the things that he says is that before you can be a good psychiatrist, you have to be a philosopher. And the psychiatrists today don't seem to understand that.
I think it's really important to understand the frameworks that people are using.
Yes. It's very rigid. It's very rigid. It's very square.
Well, it's many holes in which to place people.
Yes, yes,
compartmentalize their lives in a way which is detracting.
It's a controlling system. It's a controlling system.
It is.
It's a controlling system. It's a controlling system. Yeah, if you don't fit into the categories that are prescribed, you are basically given a diagnosis, and the pharmaceutical industry, of course, profits immensely from the production of drugs.
Yeah, look, I've been bipolar since 2013 when I had my spiritual experience. Wow.
Yeah.
And there's no cure for bipolar, and I have to be on medication for the rest of my life. That's what I was told by psychiatry. And I said, no, I discovered a photophentin system in Manuka honey. I discovered this light-based energy system that's responsible for generating hydroxy radicals. So what I was doing is really giving a mechanistic understanding of a light energy system, and they couldn't understand what I was saying, so I was diagnosed as being unwell. And the transient experience of release of the trauma from my childhood, from mum's suicide. So, I took lithium for a few years, and then risperidone and valproate. So I've been through the New Zealand psychiatric system. I have a psychologist that I go and see, month or two about. I understand their logic, their thinking, and the flaws in that as well, in terms of the science. With lithium, if you understand the single atom system coordinated to the aromatic rings of neurotransmitters and the functionality of isotope physics, then you can understand the mechanism. So I tried to explain mechanisms in the actual compounds that I had to take in order to go back to work. And it was like, well, if they're not willing to listen to a scientist to try to, describe both emotionally and scientifically, mechanistically, what's actually going on, then, that it falls on deaf ears, and there's no point in trying to be within the system to try to change the system. The framework holds them into their own narrow-minded thinking.
But they are in a crisis. Psychiatry is in a crisis because the drugs that they're using are not working.
No, they don't work. They actually do harm. And if you think about the coordination chemistry that's responsible, if they don't understand the mechanisms at play, then they will never be able to create something that's therapeutically beneficial for people.
Yes. And by the way, I also have been diagnosed bipolar. Yeah. So, but well, I think that your work is fascinating, and we will continue to discuss it. It's a question of explaining it to the public.
And in a way that is able to be understood. And I think that's been the complexity, trying to bring it down to bite-sized pieces in order so that people can look at something from a new perspective, right? Because that's what I'm sharing. I'm sharing a perspective of science that is different.
Yes. And you may well have to hook up with alternative medicine groups in order to explore your theories. Because mainstream psychiatry is simply too rigid and narrow-minded, in my experience.
They're very much embedded in a dogmatic system of scientific reductionism, right? That materialistic perspective.
Yes.
And
And
until,
in
yeah,
and in philosophy, we have transcended the mechanistic, atomistic perspective and moved towards a holistic perspective.
yeah,
And your perspective is in many ways holistic.
yeah, that's,
Uh,
yeah,
when you talk about the biological unconscious and the expansion and uh, um, reduction of the universe at the same time, and the yin yang sort of way of explaining um, your theory, um, uh, and the inner eye, light coming in through the eye.
yeah,
You know, this is all, and the fact that it's biologically based, but also drawing on physics, makes it a holistic theory. It's multidisciplinary and it's holistic,
yeah, yeah.
and that
And
in
that's the
itself is
challenge.
fascinating.
Yeah,
That's the challenge. Yeah,
that's the
yeah, that's
challenge,
the
is to
challenge.
kind of step out of the discipline that you're in order to see the wood for the trees, so to speak. You need to have the perspective of multidisciplines, right? You need
Yes,
to have a holistic, external, high-level approach that gives
yes,
you essentially the summary of what's going on,
yes,
rather
yes,
than, even though I have a very detailed physics mechanistic model, from one step at a time, I see a chronological ordering of things.
hmm
And it's very detailed. Um, and because I'm using a reductionist Western perspective, atomistic, but including isotope physics, the unstable atoms, I get transitions and energies associated with isotope physics being fundamental to human biological experience, and that quantum cohesiveness of holistic connection that one has within, right? You experience your wholeness, not your electron traveling down a gradient of energy in the mitochondria to produce ATP. You're not experiencing that, but we've created the language and science in order to understand and see that in a mechanistic detail that takes us beyond our current sensory apparatus. So we
yes, yes,
kind of deploy language in order to see things that are somewhat invisible to the human eye.
yes, yes,
And,
yes.
and and so you need to understand the language initially and what it means and what it conveys before you can
Yes,
actually engage in the communication.
yes. And I think this is the real challenge because your language is highly specialized
Yeah,
and above the understanding of the average layman. So, what I suggest is that we leave it there for tonight,
yeah.
and we continue to unpack your language and and you know
Create a
understand,
glossary.
create a glossary.
Yeah,
And I mean, we've covered the in the first session we covered the foundations of your theory. Tonight, we have looked at the biological unconscious
yeah. I
and
haven't I haven't linked that to
psychiatry.
I haven't linked that into the spiritual aspects of the unconscious, right?
You did bring that up. You did bring up briefly the
Yeah,
spiritual aspects of the unconscious, and we talked about the Mayan tradition.
yeah. But not linking
Yeah.
it to the passion lines, passion of Christ,
Well,
which is,
perhaps in the next uh, session, we'll pick up on the spiritual aspects of your theory.
okay. Okay, that sounds good. Brilliant.
Okay, okay, a pleasure.
Always, always, Alex. Thank you.
Okay. Take care, Dr. Keryn. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.